This is a special production from WBRN Radio in Boston and on the Boston Red Network. The title of the episode, The American Morality and Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner died recently. Hugh Hefner was, of all things, engaged in the enterprise of sexuality. No doubt about that. Start off here with from the Los Angeles Times. That's where he died in that area. The big headline here, Playboy founder Hugh Hefner, who shook up American morality with the idea of swinging singlehood, died at 91. You hear many things of this nature. Hugh Hefner, the incurable Playboy who built a publishing and entertainment enterprise on the idea that America should shed their puritanical hang-ups and enjoy sex, has died. Hefner was founder of Playboy magazine, launched amidst the conservatism of the 1950s. What you hear when we go out of here, a famous conservative at the time named William F. Buckley, he had a program on PBS, Firing Line. And Hugh Hefner was the guest on that particular program. But on other programs, James Baldwin was there, Muhammad Ali, and various other luminaries would be interviewed by William F. Buckley. William F. Buckley was a conservative journalist. He was a racist. And he was one of the founders of the conservative movement at that particular time. And to have Hugh Hefner there and talk about the Playboy philosophy and based upon puritanical ideas, interesting that an intellectual like Buckley would talk about this, and so-called biblical knowledge. You still have that today. We had the contest in Alabama with Judge Roy Moore, who has a literal interpretation of morality and what it is, along with conservatism. So in other words, American conservatism has always flirted with a certain version of quote-unquote morality. And so has the liberal audience. Those of us progressives have always warned against what is known as petty morality, because it is a trap within itself, period. There can be a lot of different kind of debate on what, for instance, I was debating a right-winger once that talked about good and bad. Well, good and bad are questions in the language, in the semantics. In other words, if you're talking about a bad situation, it's a non-productive situation. A good situation is a productive situation, as it is in the national semantics, particularly in the U.S. Now, do we use terms as that, or do we go to, for instance, a factual exclamation of an event, or do we go to a true and false a situation? And it depends on the speaker, in other words, the active voice there, as to what is true and what is false. And we progressive, particularly atheists like myself, look at things from a different point of view, dialectics. In other words, it's a mixture of positives and negatives. And if you want to associate negatives with false, that's good. Positives with truth, that is okay. We're not going to quiver. But what Hugh Hefner was talking about, now this interview, you can look it up, was in a black and white at the time. And William Buckley was talking about basically the old-time religion, but the old-time religion of 200 years in the past. Very superficial argument there in a different society. What Hefner did, and we'll talk also about the misogynist, exploitive parts of the Playboy enterprise, because it was an enterprise. It was a commercial enterprise, but at the same time it had an effect on the body politic and the social fabric of the country, because it was a precursor to the women's movement, which was a different situation. We could get into the dynamics of so-called pornography and where pornography was. And pornography in the U.S. has always been a commercial enterprise. And in the world, it's exploitive at its root. There's no doubt about that, because it's done for financial gain. Now, the Playboy situation was a little bit different in that, yes, there were Playboy clubs, but those were venues where people like Dick Gregory, Bill Cosby, African-American comedians could come and entertain the audiences there. So it not only served as just a commercial enterprise, but as a social enterprise which warped into the politics of the country. Bunnies were there, yes. Women were presented there as flesh. There's no doubt about that. But today, 2017, we look at what has occurred since the Playboy evolution, or revolution, a sexual revolution, and into Silicon Valley. Still vast and crass discrimination against women there, that in many of the roles, you'll notice that I was recently at a tech conference, the people doing the serving function there were women. And it was a different situation. They were not restaurant workers or per se. They were so-called ambassadors, we'll call it as that. People that introduce people. You go to these various kinds of conferences, you'll have people there that take care of, quote-unquote, the clerical functions, and they normally are women. And they're put there. If you go to Vegas, we used to have something called the Comdex, a big technical show, and of course now they have the electronics show, but you'll find many of the people on the floor, the same thing with the auto show in Detroit, are women that sell the cars, at least the image of the cars. There's an old term, is the ad, quote-unquote, as sexy. So we look at that as deeply rooted in the American context more so than it is in other countries. The historic use in the advertising world of sexism. So when we talk about and condemn Hugh Hefner's enterprise, we need to look at the larger society, period. Now, in the LATimes article here, it mentions Playboy, it mentions Playmates, it mentions people that were in the magazine also. Albert Schweitzer was there, Malcolm X was there, John Updike was there. Even Jimmy Carter appeared in a Playboy magazine, if you can believe that one. And that was looked at as a different situation. Yes, they had the Playmate on the cover and the spread in the middle, but it was tame to compared to today what you can see on the web there on the so-called X-rated thing. In other words, X-rated has become R or G or whatever you want to call it. People 90 can look at it. People 9 years old can look at it. So in other words, all of that is there. And if you go into just a general entertainment, in other words, movies that are at the cinema, you'll see basically the same thing. And now with streaming movies and etc. that are on the net, the age was not matter. You can find any kind of genre that you wish to find. And Hugh Hefner was at the start of that. And of course, you later had Larry Flynn and various others. The mansion there in Chicago, 48 rooms, and there was one also in Los Angeles or in Beverly Hills. If you remember from the trial, Bill Cosby was there. One of the things that was there, and also Gloria Steinem actually was one of the bunnies. She was on the cover. That was the so-called beginning of the cultural wars. One of the first shots when she posed as a bunny, that was Gloria Steinem. She's now 80 years old, wrote a scathing expose in Show magazine in 1963. Reading Playboy, she later said, felt a little like a Jew reading a Nazi manual. Gloria Steinem, of course, was Jewish, and so was Hugh Hefner. Well, that is an extreme there. Ms. Steinem, look out the window now, a totally different kind of situation. You have the Nazis in the White House. Hugh Hefner was not into that sort of situation, period. And looking forward here, the Meese, Ed Meese, a criminal type that was in the Reagan administration, Commission on Pornography. Conservatives have always wanted to run around and get into pornography and explore it. And later came Jerry Falwell. More Larry Flynn was dealing, and Larry Flynn's still alive, was dealing with Falwell, and he made fun of Falwell in his moral minority. But this whole thing, and you had in the 80s, as we go from William Buckley to the so-called TV preachers, and most of them were exposed as charlatans and purveyors of various perversions that they preached so much about. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a so-called American morality that was never there in the first place. It was just an hypocrisy. Now, that was one service that Hugh Hefner brought out to the people, because all types of people read, looked at Playboy magazine, the interviews there, or perhaps a spread. We, as a young people in the 50s, would find it. I remember they used to have it at the stores, and they would have a wrapper on it. And, of course, you could get it in the Post, and in university we all got it and shared it together, etc. But the intellectual content of it was above what you would see today. Now, the magazines now are all on the net and available in digital format. In fact, Playboy itself had to recast itself because of so many imitators, and just literally as any print magazine, they at one time even took the nudes out. The nudes came back in. They went into films. The Playboy clubs are all basically closed now, down. So that is no longer there. But the entertainment is there. You have various kinds of vineyards out there that have bunny-like people walking around without the rest of the philosophy. So in other words, the content has come down, but the heathenistic, if you want to call it that, is still there. So you would find this in to the 80s. You found Hugh Hefner out there, and of course he moved it on to his daughter Christy Hefner, but they stayed out there. Period. Let me just get a quote here. Much of my life has been like an adolescent dream of an adult life, he told LATimes in 1992. If you were still a boy, it's almost a Peter Pan kind of way. You could have just the perfect life that you wanted to have, and that life I invented for myself. That was Hugh Hefner talking there, and about his parents, etc. CNN has a little article here by Peggy Dexler on the 29th, actually, of September, called The Dark Side of Hugh Hefner. Here, the founder of the Playboy brand was a media pioneer, no doubt, an icon of the left, an early and very vocal advocate for free speech, civil rights, and a sexual revolution. Well, that was one of the things that was at Woodstock. These are 60s things, late 60s for Woodstock, that sexual liberation came out there, and there were people in the society that were opposed to it. It was sort of like the kneeling now at football games. If you want to get into the abstract, But people that kneel at football games are talking about social justice. Playboy did that, but in the realm of a commercial enterprise. Whereas I guess you could say the football players actually are engaged in football, which is a commercial enterprise, but they are moving with social justice. But that is not the business of the National Football League, period. Let me go back to the article. Here's no question, as an activist, Hep paved the way for open talk about sex, sexuality, giving people the permission to admit that they too were sexual beings and at least wanted to enjoy sex. In the Playboy clubs opened in the 60s, he hired African-American comics, and we mentioned that as Dick Gregory, at a time when you had de facto segregation. That's the time of apartheid was still there. And meanwhile, as a publisher, he pushed the boundaries with articles. Yes, the famous article that men claim they sought in Playboy. That was groundbreaking, investigative pieces by writers Hunter S. Thompson and interviews with people like even Dr. King was in there, and of course others. And there was the Playboy Foundation. We talked a little bit about them. I worked at one time at a NGO that got a small grant from Playboy. I think it was $500 or $1,000 there. And it goes on here. The open dialogue. He worked his whole life to encourage. But Hefner's egalitarian society was one largely envisioned, and it was created for men. There was no doubt about that. No one would argue about the misogyny at that time in the society. It has not disappeared. It is still alive and well. Women get about 80%, if they are lucky, of the income of men in the society. Many of the corporate positions, leadership positions, are occupied by men, period, particularly European males. In the presidential contest, the Hillary Clinton, one of the first time that a woman had ran or had the nomination of a major party, was confronted by misogyny. Now, no doubt about that. What percentage of people out there would not vote for a woman running for president? We don't know, but I would think it was probably as high as perhaps 15 or 20%, not only of men, but of women also, that because of Hillary Clinton's sex did not vote for her. Now, it's all wrapped up also in policies back to William F. Buckley, the conservatism there. That has always been wrapped up. Roy Moore did not invent that. The Republican Party has been utilizing that particular trait since Buckley, but they used it where we seen, at least in the American context, during the administration of Ronald Wilson Reagan. That's when you had Ed Meese and various characters like that, and old Ed Meese is still alive. And you had these moral majority, Phyllis Shapley. All these things were put in there for a reason. And then came the so-called social issues, abortion, that is still loudly played. The tune is, as they say, can be heard from the Texas state capitol in Austin to various other state capitals. There was a big hurrah about same-sex marriage down there with Miss Davis. That kind of disappeared. Now, couples of the same sex are getting married in all of the states. In fact, Roy Moore was removed for not doing that. He instructed the Justice of the Peace system there in Alabama not to obey the Supreme Court. Justice Moore had to go down, but now Justice Moore is in a position he could go to the Senate. So in other words, these things are all still there. They have not left. So Hefner was in the social, and that later translated into the political content. We did not pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Hefner was in favor of it, and it bogged down in the states. I think there were one or two states that did not ratify it, and that's how it bogged down. Today you'd have much more difficulty because when Hefner was operating, it was not polarized as it is today. Hefner himself bragged about sleeping with more than 1,000 women. I wouldn't doubt that in his memo, Down the Rabbit Hole, period. And again, there were tragedies there. Back to the article, Hep championed the world in which women served to the light entertainment of men, where their bodies were objects, and where modification to appeal to male senses often took precedent over comfort, etc. there. And of course you had all kinds of things going on. They were the bunnies, the lucky ones anyway. The small price by a well-known journalist that he ran in his magazine. Every female journalist, like Margaret Atwood, were designed to enrich the intellect of the magazine's male readers. There was no doubt about that it was a male magazine. But today, given the present economic setup, the magazine could not make it as that. It's more of a, or it had turned to more of a commentary. Because if some of you remember the cartoons that were in there, always interesting. But with all the things that you have on what is collectively called the net, including the fake news. Now, Hef and Playboy did not publish fake news. Their news was serious commentary. The only thing there that I saw in Playboy, and I used to read it all the time, was the centerfolds, which were tamed by today's situation. The Playboy clubs were elegant. They had entertainment there. Of course, they had the bunnies there. But that would be in virtually any nightclub setting that you'll see today, scantily clad women running around if it is set up there. And of course, now you have quote-unquote gentlemen's clubs that are imitations of the Playboy, cheap imitations of the Playboy club that have wrestling reality shows and all kinds of goofy stuff there. Let me just finish this article up. And that another of Hep's legacies, the appetite for readily available sex. Of course, well, the internet has, and this is the article, what she makes here. But we should recognize that his legacy is not an unpredictable one. It is to say, at least a complicated one. Well, everything's complicated. Was Hefner a feminist? He may have thought he was, but perhaps like many men of a certain age, his definition was surely due for a tune-up. This is what Ms. what was her name here? Drexler said there. Well, Hefner's version, yes, was a different version. We no doubt about that. And the New York Times, who built the Playboy empire and embodied it. Well, he did do that, no doubt. So what we tried to do here was to bring out who Hugh Hefner was, what he played in the social, political content of America. And you also look at the enormous amount of money that was introduced into the economy by Hugh Hefner clones, we'll call them. A lot of money to be made there. And at one time, the other side of the pornography industry is still out there that make all kinds of films. And they sold these films out of back doors in corners. So now you have all kinds of genres that you can think of in that line of the business. But Hefner was unique. Even Flynn, Larry Flynn, he was out of Cincinnati. He had his Hustler magazine. I don't know if it's still around anymore or not, but it had its spreads in it, and it had some interviews in it also. On a different line, he basically didn't get, as they say, the first types, but at the same time, it was in there, especially in the free speech movement. All these magazines contributed to that. The breaking down there, and you'll hear in the little clip we have, I think it's about 15 minutes from a firing line, that was William H. Buckley, talking about the Warren Court. The Warren Court, of course, was a liberal court, is no longer around. And with the conservative people, when Anton Scalia was around, there was a different definition of pornography, but that went beyond just pornography. What is pornography, in my opinion, is to deny millions of people health care, to suppress the vote. And those are things that are being done at the present time. So you don't have to go to talk about morality, to deal with situations like what is occurring now in Puerto Rico. We did a show, incidentally, on Puerto Rico and compared it to Trump's Katrina. But now Trump has had DJ Trump, that is, had the audacity to come out and call the Puerto Ricans lazy because they weren't doing enough to help themselves. Well, this situation is totally different. Ships are arriving. Military personnel are arriving, but they're arriving very slowly. People there are dying for not even having their insulin. And this in itself is an affront to humanity. And let's take a little break here and we'll do this. The scores are from the next to last game that was on a Saturday night of the regular Major League Baseball season. We had the Astros were in Fenway Park. Red Sox 6-3. The Sox are officially in the big show. In other words, they are going to postseason. Toronto and the Yankees 2-1. The Yankees over Toronto. The Yankees also going to postseason. The Cubs shut out the Reds in Wrigley Field. 9-0. The Cubs won their division. They're going to postseason. Two teams that are not, the Padres and the Giants. Padres 3-2. The Brewers and the Cardinals 7-6. The Cardinals effectively knocking the Brewers out of postseason. The Orioles and the Rays, two more teams that we won't be seeing after later today on Sunday. 4-3 was the score. Rays over Orioles. The Pirates and the Nationals. Pirates won that game 4-1 in Washington. The Nationals won their division, so Dusty and company will meet the Cubs in Wrigley Field. And in 11, the Mets were in Philadelphia. Mets 4-7. The White Sox were in Cleveland. Sox 2-1. Cleveland is on its way also to postseason. The Tigers and Twins. Tigers pull that one out 3-2. Atlanta and the Marlins. Marlins 10-2 in that contest. The D-backs and Royals in Kansas City. Royals 4-3. The D-backs will play the Rockies in one of the wild cards next week. The Athletics and Rangers in Texas. Rangers 8-4. The Dodgers and Rockies. The Dodgers pull that one out 5-3 in Denver. Kenley Jansen got the save, and they will, of course, be in the postseason also. The Mariners and Angels out in California. Mariners 6-4. So that is how they stand here. Look very quickly at the standing. I think we covered everyone. The Red Sox are there. The Yankees are all going to postseason in the American League East and the American League Central. The Twins are going to postseason with Cleveland. And in the American League West, it's the Astros. In the National League East, the Washington Nationals. Others, they are staying home. In the Central, the Cubs. In the West, this National League West, the Dodgers, and as we mentioned before, the Diamondbacks of Arizona and the Rockies of Colorado. That is the lineup and the playoff schedule. We'll get it up here next week. Will be October the 5th. Oops, wait a minute here. Let's get the wild cards. First here, the wild card, the American League wild card, the Twins and Yankees on ESPN on October the 3rd. In the National League one, the Rockies and D-backs on Wednesday the 4th. Now, the division playoffs will start with the Red Sox at the Astros in Game 1. And then the winner at Cleveland in Game 1 also here. They've got a list here. And then more Red Sox at the Astros in Game 2. And let's see. And the wild card winner will be at Cleveland in Game 1, and that is the American League. So that I would be the Yankees are the Twins, and the Astros and Red Sox. They will be going with that division through October the 8th. So in other words, we'll have those going on here. And let's see, let's go to the National League. That will start on Friday, October the 6th. The wild card winner will be in Dodger Stadium. The Cubs at the Nationals, Game 1 on a Friday night. And the wild card winner will be at the Dodgers, and the Cubs at the Nationals, Game 2 on Saturday. So actually they will start out in D.C. And the Dodgers at the wild card, that'll be on Monday the 9th. And the Nationals will be at the Cubs, let me get that right, in Wrigley Field on October the 9th. And the Dodgers will be at the wild card on the 10th. That's in the National League. And we'll finish it up if we go that far along. The wild card will be at the Dodgers, and the Cubs will be at the Nationals. That's Game 5 of that series. And then the League Championship Series will start on Friday the 13th. The American League Championship Series there. And the National League will be on the 14th. That'll be on a Saturday. And then the World Series will start on Tuesday, October 24th. And if needed, will end on the 1st of November, if you can believe that. Will be on Fox, which we will not watch. Nonetheless, that does it for Major League Baseball. Our special program here. Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Philosophy. We're messing around with the title a little bit. We'll get it straight. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll talk to you on the Monday morning quarterback as the Boston Red part of the scheme. Now, we also, on many of these same outlets, have Numbers Man there. That's our macroeconomic program, talking about GDP. And we had the new GDP figures out there, and also the effects of the GOP proposed tax reduction package. We have it quarterback for you also. And somewhere in between here, we'll throw in an open source report. Good day.
As the founder, editor, and publisher of Playboy magazine, and the entrepreneur of related enterprises, among them the Playboy clubs, which are designed simultaneously to stimulate all the senses. Mr. Hefner's magazine is most widely known for its total exposure of the human female, though of course other things happen in its pages. But Mr. Hefner insists that it is a great deal more. There is such a thing as a Playboy philosophy, of which he is the prophet, and that philosophy is destined to liberate us all from what he variously calls superstition, puri, tyranny, moral absolutism, that kind of thing. The philosophy made its debut approximately 4 years ago, and to the surprise of everyone and the horror of some, still continues chapter after chapter, issue after issue, vouchsafing to the world the philosophy of Mr. Hugh Hefner. Although Mr. Hefner deals with a number of subjects, once again, it is his views on sex that are especially controversial and especially observed. I should like to ask him, just to begin with, whether he rejects conventional Judeo-Christian codes of sexual behavior. Mr. Hefner?
Yes, at the essence of them, I think I do. The philosophy, really, I think, is an anti-Puritanism, a response, really, to the Puritan part of our culture. So, to that extent, sex, I think, is a part of the Judeo-Christian ethic that kind of got lost, and is the part that is restrictive and not truly, I think, naturalistic.
Well, the Judeo-Christian code, obviously, as we know, antedated Puritanism, didn't it?
Yes, it covers a lot of ground.
I'm not talking about whether or not you reject Cotton Mather's accretions on the Mosaic Law, but whether you reject the Mosaic Law. Do you reject, for instance, monogamy? Do you reject the notion of sexual continence before marriage? Yourself, that is to say, you as a philosopher of the new ideal of sexual liberation.
Well, I think what it really comes down to is an attempt to establish what's been called a new morality, and I really think that's what the American, this thing called the American Sexual Revolution is really all about. It's an attempt to replace the old legalism. It's certainly not a rejection of monogamy as such, but very much an attempt, in the case of premarital sex, there really hasn't been any moral code in the past except simply a thou shalt not. And
well, that's a code, isn't it?
Well, perhaps. I don't think it's a very realistic one.
Well,
gentlemen, may we continue in just a moment after this brief interruption?
Well, Mr. Hefner, if you do in fact reject what is commonly known as the Christian code or the religious code, why do you take the position that the Playboy philosophy is really, in a sense, non-controversial, that it is sort of congruent with the new reality, if in fact you have rewritten the ancient theological tablets? Oughtn't you to claim some kind of a moral authority to do so? And if so, what is that moral authority? Is it only your own intuition, or what is it?
Well, first of all, I don't think that just related to sex, just that part of the philosophy, this is not really a rejection in any real sense of the total Christian ethic related to sex. It's an attempt to reevaluate some of the social sexual ills of our time, and I think that what's going on in society at this particular time, this quest for a new morality, is something that we're only, one small voice in, and it's really an attempt to supply a 20th century code. Although I dislike the word code, because I think the old legalism is part of the problem. I think that hopefully we're going to evolve a more what's been called situation ethics, an approach to ethical problems where sex is concerned, not unlike the approach that we use where other problems are concerned. In no other area of morality, I don't think, is it as cut and dried that you follow a certain law simply to follow that law, even if it sometimes takes you out the window. In the case of premarital sex, I think you've got the prime example of this.
How so?
Well, we've taken the attitude traditionally, and this certainly didn't begin, it's not Christian in the sense that it came from Christ per se, but it's something that grew through the organization and historical, the anti-sexual aspect of the Christian ethic grew through the centuries and became especially extreme in the Puritan and Victorian thing that we suffer from here in America. And it's a rejection of the notion that sex can have any real place, any moral place prior to marriage. And I don't think this is really, I don't think it's logical. I think we know a great deal more about the psychosexual nature of man now that indicates that it's not logical. I don't think it's truly to the best interest of people, and I don't think it's truly moral, in the sense that we would apply the word moral or ethical in any other area of activity.
Well, I know that is your view, but I think what is interesting is your authority for stating it. I'm not suggesting that you don't have the right to promulgate your own point of view. I'm simply suggesting that it is rather unusual to see you, as you describe your philosophy, express a sense of shock that moral exegetes during the preceding 2,000 years should have had the nerve to disagree with you. It is, I think, important for the record to establish that you are seeking, in effect, to annul the traditional code about what is proper sexual behavior. But let me ask you this.
I'm suggesting that it be re-examined. You suggested that two or three times, or stated to it. It's not true that I'm, by any sense, because the end that I'm seeking is really very similar. I think that we are more apt to have a truly monogamous society if we do more realistically come to grips with some of these problems. I think that we've avoided the problems with some of these old rules that have simply been there and ignored much of the time.
Well, but do you, as a matter of fact, tend to take the position in which you would not be unique, that any moral laws that don't, in fact, reflect human behavior are themselves philosophically suspect? That is to say, I know that, for instance, you cite Kinsey with extraordinary enthusiasm, as though he had, in fact, liberated your thinking on the matter. And you say, well, look, here Kinsey observes that the typical human male and the typical human female are sexually promiscuous, and under the circumstances, we ought to reverse our laws and our public attitudes in order to make permissible and perhaps even admirable that which, in fact, happens. Are you a positivist in this sense?
I think that only becomes part of it. I don't think that it follows per se that simply because a thing is done, even done by a majority of people, that it is necessarily the best and moral thing. But I think that when you are involved with or are concerned with a natural physical drive and something as basic to the nature of man as sex is, that when you do get scientific evidence, as Kinsey has supplied, that indicates the great disparity. This, to me, is the value of Kinsey, indicated for the first time statistically the great disparity that existed between our professed beliefs and the actual actions of society. I don't think it follows, therefore, per se, that what has been revealed as what is occurring is necessarily moral, but as one good reason for questioning some of the old morality. I think that the reasons are a good deal deeper than that. The real reasons are that many of these moral views are not good for people. That good, just, humane ends do not come from these old traditions. And I think that premarital sex, since that's what we're talking about here at the moment, premarital sex can be moral or immoral, just as marital sex can.
Well, now, but what qualifies you to advance this position? It is, of course, a position which happens to be, again, highly congruent with a highly saleable philosophy. Your magazine has a lot of readers and is considered sort of exciting in virtue of its sexual iconoclasm. But it does seem to me that the background of people who have taken it on themselves to reverse ancient attitudes about very sacred matters has been one of a lifetime of study and a certain amount of moral agony given over to these questions, but Playboy all of a sudden simply announces that thanks in part to it, we simply have to repeal these ancient attitudes. And I have seen in your own Playboy philosophy no other justification for it than that people ought not to be afflicted with a tormented conscience simply because they give way to their sexual libidos, irrespective of the consequences. Now, that is really, in effect, your position, i.e., isn't it?
No, not at all.
It's sort of a hedonistic utilitarianism on advanced
Well,
John
I've
Stuart
been
Mill.
the philosophy, this editorial series that we've been involved in, has been, if it's been criticized for one single thing, it has been its verbosity, and much of that has been due to the fact that we've quoted at great length a great many sources. I think that scientific, religious, practical, and philosophical, related to these questions. It seems to me that what you're really saying is, what right have I to express what are admittedly only my own particular evaluations of the situation? And it seems to me that that's what a free society is all about.
No, I recognize you're right, and I specifically conceded it a moment ago under the Constitution of the United States. Say anything you want at all. What I'm here to question is your credentials as a serious moral teacher. And it seems to me, though, that the flavor of your protracted sermon in Playboy is simply to speak about those who disagree with you as old, crotchety Puritans who unfortunately don't share your sense of enlightenment. In connection with what you said, and I think it bears very, very directly on your point, you say that the Kinsey report revealed a considerable disparity between what actually goes on and what people suppose goes on. Why do you say that? That is to say, to whom do you suppose that the Kinsey report came as a great surprise? Can you imagine for instance, a Catholic confessor who would have been surprised by the Kinsey report?
No,
why did Christ refer to his disposition to forgive a sinner 70 times 7 times unless he anticipated the possibility of 490 sins?
I think it came as a great surprise to the general public. No, I don't think it came as a surprise to people who are deeply involved in this kind of problem, whether on the religious side or on the social or psychological side. But for the general public, the revelations in the report, I think, were very much an eye-opener. But more than that, they brought them out into the public print. And this, again, I think, is where Playboy is, and the philosophy are really important. It is not... I don't think that any particular, although I agree that many aspects of the philosophy are, in one sense, controversial, in that these are the things that, these social questions are the things that are being debated in society today. The philosophy is not really putting forth a unique or original point of view. Mm-hmm. The major thing I think that we're in a position to do, and happily so from my own point of view, is to permit the exchange of views on these things and to probe into some of the questions that do not find a general airing in the popular press. And I think this is one of the problems that we've suffered from in the past, related to sex and some other questions too.
Well, I don't deny that you occasionally ambush a dissenter into writing in your columns so as to be slapped down by your very skillful editors. But there is a Playboy line.
Very much so. Very much so.
That Playboy line is a line that, for instance, refers to the, quotes, bugaboo of sin, refers to, quotes, sacred cows. And as I understand it, the bugaboo of sin is your reference to those theological sanctions that attempt to restrain certain people from giving way to lustful anxieties on the grounds that to do so is wrong. What I don't understand is what I wish you would explain to me is why you simply brush aside the very concept of wrong and right, why you feel that that they are highly irrelevant, provided you have, as you so frequently put it, two consenting adults.
What I attack is the notion that right and wrong should be related simply to the notion of sin, simply to a notion of thou shalt not, rather than related to the real ultimate interests of the human beings involved. That's what the philosophy is all about.
But do you suppose that the people who wrote the Bible, some people even allege that they were divinely inspired, or against the ultimate interests of people?
Are you
going to die a happier man than St. Francis of Assisi as a result of your pursuit of hedonism?
Basic sexual ethic is really based upon the Bible per se. It's much more complex than that, and became, much more restrictive than that.
Well, I would find it a much easier geographical act to trace a line between Puritanism and the Bible than between the Playboy Philosophy and the Bible.
Yes, I think that's right.
Although I agree with you that there are certain accretions which have never been acknowledged by all theological thinkers, but all theological Christians, theologically trained thinkers, take the position that simply because somebody desires to do something doesn't necessarily make it right. But I don't understand you to be taking this position. I think we're overlooking
a very important key in this thing. One of the basic things that we have argued against is the notion that in our particular concept of a free society, with the emphasis that is placed in America on the separation of church and state, that the notion of sin, or predicating these social sexual taboos on any kind of religious concept, that this is not a proper approach in a society in which that is supposed to be pluralistic and supposed to be secular. It doesn't mean that each particular religious denomination can't come up with their own particular evaluation of sin as they see it, but I don't think that sin should have any particular place in secular society as such, because it's a religious concept and should remain that.